if you'd rather go way above and beyond on a client project than do a little bit of sales and marketing work, if you're more interested in crunching numbers than shaking hands, if you think networking should be about routers rather than cocktails with strangers, but somehow you ended up with sales and marketing responsibilities, this podcast is for you. Hi, Chief Nerd Ruben Swartz here, and I spent a long time learning these lessons the hard way. I want to help you learn them the easy way by sharing my experiences and talking with brilliant people who have figured out how to hack not just the code, but the sales and marketing process as well. Of course, as a nerdy person, I had to create a software application to help service-oriented people get more clients. So if you'd like to get more leads and turn more of them into clients and break out of the feast or famine cycle, check out Mimiran.com. That's MIMIRAN.com. You can find the application and also sample lead magnet and contract templates to help you grow your business. Now let's get to it. So today I'm super excited to have Craig Elias on Sales for Nerds. Craig is the author of Shift, which I refer to in my head as shift selling because it's really about sales. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. For those of you who don't know Craig, I don't know exactly how I ran into him, but I kept hearing about how I should listen to this guy talk about when you can use trigger events to be more effective in selling. And a lot of the stuff that he's talked about has been instrumental philosophically in how I think about selling and how my software works and so on. Craig is the number 15 on LinkedIn's list of top 50 B2B sales experts and number 1 in Canada. He has a computer science and a business degree, and he's joining us today from Calgary. Craig, welcome.
Ruben, thank you very much for having me.
So how are things up in Calgary right now for those of us who may be thinking that we're suffering through winter?
Yeah. So it's chilly. It's not cold by our standards. It was, I think it got to minus 18 this morning, but it didn't last long. It's like minus 8 or minus 10. We haven't had much snow yet. Oh, we tend to get snow early in the year. Or early in the season. So I went to Australia back in October, and 2 days before I left, we had 50 centimeters, so a foot and a half of snow the day before I left for Australia. But right now, there's no snow on the ground.
All right. Well, that's not too bad for Calgary.
No.
So what do you have in your glass, Craig?
So what I have in my glass is Tom Gore. This is my favorite California cab Sauv. 2016, and whenever I put a good steak on the barbecue, this is what I bring out.
Awesome. That sounds delicious. I've got some Parducci True Grit Reserve Petite Syrah from 2014. As those of you who listen regularly know, I sometimes get in a little bit of a Pinot Noir rut, so I'm kind of excited that today we've got some Cabernet and some Petite Syrah going on. Well, cheers and welcome.
Thank you.
And maybe tell me a little bit about how did you get into sales? You don't usually see folks with computer science degrees getting into sales, although if you're on this podcast, there's a good chance that that's what happened to you.
So it's funny because I have my first degree is actually a cross-disciplinary computer science business.
Okay.
And the way that I put myself through university, because my parents got divorced and I started at the age of 19 trying to put myself through school. I actually started at DeVry. Do you remember DeVry?
Uh-huh.
And it just turned out that it was too easy. So my dad kicked my ass and said, get out there and challenge yourself. So I started going through computer science and business, started at York University, but I spent most of my time working while I was going through school, and I was working in the hospitality sector. And when I got my first job, so when I graduated from the University of Western Ontario, I was working in a part of Toronto called Yonge and Eligible.
Okay.
So it's technically Yonge and Eglinton, but there are more single people per square mile around that intersection than anywhere else in Canada. So I was working at this bar/restaurant, and it was actually one of the guys I worked with. His name was Jim. Jim was a recruiter, and he asked me if I wanted this job to go work for a company back then that was called AMP. So when you connect your iPhone or Samsung to a cable or a computer, those things at the ends, those interconnects, that's what I was selling. And I went for this interview, which I remember very distinctly. And the lady who ran the interview, her name was Donna. And she says, well, why do you want this job as an inside salesperson? I said, because I want to be an outside sales. And she says, yeah, we take engineers, we train them for 2 years, and then we put those people into outside sales. That's not going to happen. So I thought, no way, I got the job. But it turns out I did get the job. And then like 60 days later, her husband, Mel, who ran outside sales for all of Canada, he comes to me and says, Craig, I have a problem. I need an outside sales rep in Edmonton, and none of the engineers are ready, but you seem to be a guy who would be good for that role. And there I was, a few months later, living in Edmonton, which is about 3 hours north of Calgary, started an outside sales. And I ended up there for a couple of years and got parachuted and brought into Toronto for something, and then was parachuted out of Toronto and ended up in Vancouver. And I was just this lucky sales guy who for almost 20 years had this unbelievable knack of just showing up in front of the right people at exactly the right time. And that's how it all got started.
Now, how did you get that first job with Donna? She just told you were unqualified and then she hired you.
You know what? It's funny. One day I should actually pick up the phone and say, what made you hire me? Even though I said that I wanted to be an outside sales, because it was kind of like this. It wasn't a fight, but you know how sometimes with your wife or significant other, you sort of have this conversation that's slightly testy, but there's still something there. It was like that. So I never thought to ask. I have to go back and ask her now.
All right. So you end up getting this job. You end up in outside sales, which is exactly what you wanted.
Yeah.
And how do you learn sales? Do you know sales at this point?
I don't. But here's the thing I'm a big believer of. I'm a big believer that sales is based upon relationships. And I had one primary objective. And my primary objective was always, how do I be the first person people phone when something comes up?
Okay.
That was the only thing that I was focused on. How do I find a way to be responsive, be reliable, and bring some sort of results? And I always thought that as long as I did those things, I would be successful. I had no idea why it worked. I just knew that it worked.
Now, how did you know that at a relatively young age? Did you read it somewhere? Did somebody tell you that? Or did you just kind of come to that conclusion?
That's a good question. I think when you come from the customer service sector, that the way you maximize your tips is based upon those three things.
Got it.
And I just kind of figured, let's see what happens if I apply those customer service skills to sales. And I just got totally lucky.
So people should really start by tending bar or waiting tables if they want to get into sales.
Well, and you know what's interesting? So if there's anybody on the call that's looking for a really good person to put into sales, I would highly recommend, so Starbucks would be a place I would go to on a regular basis, and just see if you find someone who's got that really customer-focused personality, who doesn't get down, who just finds a way to always be there no matter what happens and doesn't get frustrated. Like I talk about that all the time.
That makes a lot of sense. All right. So now you're moving all over Canada,
Yep.
Getting parachuted into wherever they need you. And what's going on? Are you selling stuff? Things are going well?
I am, I would be totally on fire. So a couple of things that I find really interesting. On multiple occasions, I would be the first guy in the country to sell a brand new product or service. So I was very focused because we were sort of leading edge technology and our stuff was always more expensive. What I found is I was always way more effective at getting people's interest and attention if I showed them the stuff that was new or the stuff that was coming up, so they could then put it into their designs, knowing full well there was not a whole lot of competition when it came time for them to produce the equipment that had my stuff specified inside.
Got it. Okay.
I read a really good book. In fact, I still have it. It was called Consultative Selling by a guy named Mac Hannon. And one of the things that Mac helped me figure out was how to, lack of a better term, dollarize your solution.
Okay.
So when I read Spin Selling for the first time, chapter 4, I think is the best 30 pages ever written about sales, pages 66 to 95, I think it is.
Okay.
And it's all about the implications of the problem. So when I started in sales, I always seemed to have a $10 solution to a $5 problem.
Okay.
And what I learned after reading some of the Neil Rackham stuff was that it's about the impact or implications of the problem that they have. And then I began to realize that some of the equipment that could come with the technology I was selling could drive down the manufacturing costs. So I then bumped into some of the stuff by Mac Hannon. And what I would start doing, instead of just selling to engineers, now I'm selling to VPs of operations, saying, hey, if you use a little bit of automation, even though the parts are more expensive, the overall cost goes down.
Right. Okay.
And I would start doing these sort of, lack of a better term, ROI analysis. And I remember one occasion It was an account I had inherited from somebody else. Our competitors were all over this account. And after I had let them use the equipment for 30 days, I walked into a meeting with my boss and my boss's boss into the VP of operations for this facility. And we're having this conversation about the equipment. And this guy just said, I don't care how much you charge me for the product, but that machine does not leave this factory. And we displaced every competitor in one foul swoop just by doing that. So that for me was another big turning point around being able to understand the implications of a problem and the fact that the problem is very often bigger than what we think it is. And if we can understand the scope of the problem, it's not that hard to sell a slightly more expensive solution.
Yeah, that's something I struggled with tremendously when I was starting out. I'd be so excited when somebody talked about the symptoms of something that I could fix and address that I would immediately dive into the symptoms instead of trying to understand the underlying disease and then beyond that, the actual implications of having that disease.
Yeah, what's the ramifications? And it becomes a huge problem. Someone's got a $2 thing that's not working, but they're having all these parts being returned. It turns out it's a $100 million problem for a $2 part.
Right. Okay, so you're basically kicking ass and taking names.
Totally.
And then what?
So then what ended up happening is I moved to Calgary. So I went to work for a distributor of the manufacturer that I used to have.
Okay.
And I lasted 9 months in that job, got promoted to district manager, running Western Canada. Managed to get lucky around a few decisions. We were growing by leaps and bounds. And at the same time this is going on, I have a counterpart in Toronto. His name is John. And John's doing an executive MBA. And I'm like, okay, I'm in my early 30s. I have no kids. I'm really good at sales, but I need to understand finance and some business stuff. So I want to do an executive MBA. And I asked my then boss, Mark, on 3 different occasions about doing an executive MBA. And every time he said, I want you to focus on your job. You're doing a great thing. Like, keep growing, keep growing. And on the 3rd time round, I just said, look, Mark, I'm 36. I have no kids. You're not my dad. I don't need your permission. I quit. I'm going to go do an executive MBA. And I moved to Calgary at the same time to do the executive MBA there, and then joined a company called WorldCom. Remember WorldCom?
Yeah, not in a good way.
$11 billion in accounting fraud with a B. I joined them the day before 9/11. And even in a post 9/11 environment, in less than 6 months, I become the number 1 sales guy in the entire country. And unfortunately, 21 days after I become the number 1 sales guy in the entire country, the CFO for WorldCom admits to conducting $11 billion in accounting fraud. And for the first time in my life, nobody would buy from me. And I couldn't figure this out. And I'm a pretty determined guy. So after selling off a couple of nice cars that I had and buying a VW Rabbit turbo diesel to get around in, I spent a summer and I reflected on my luck as a sales guy.
Okay.
When was I good? When was I great? And when was I just unstoppable? And I figured out the stuff that led me to start my first company. And what I kind of figured out was most of my luck was just timing. I got in front of people who were dissatisfied with the status quo, were thinking of changing, but hadn't done anything about it yet. And that my average close ratio when that happened was 80%.
Got it. Okay.
And that was like, hang on a second. I think I can do something here with the business. Now, what happened on a personal level when WorldCom admitted to conducting all that accounting fraud, the lady that I was engaged to, that I'd been with for about 6 years, she came home from work that day and said, if there's no security in your job, I'm not having kids. And 3 weeks later, she moved out.
Wow. Okay.
So I'm like, I'm almost 40. I've always promised myself I'd be an entrepreneur, but if I was, I wanted to do it before I was 40. So it's 6 weeks before my 40th birthday. I'm like,
better get going.
Let's go.
Right.
So I took this, I took this little idea about this opportunity to sell something, and I did some research. And basically what I figured out was that every business-to-business salesperson in North America, on average, learns of $1 million worth of stuff that their customers want, but it's not what that salesperson sells.
Okay.
So in the heads of every B2B salesperson, is $1 million worth of stuff. And at the time, my research said there was about 3 million people in the world of B2B sales. So in the heads of salespeople is $3 trillion worth of information that they do nothing with 75% of the time.
Okay, got it. I'm following so far.
Yeah, so what I decided to do was create a two-sided exchange. How do I get salespeople to give me the information about customers that are thinking of changing but haven't done anything yet? And how do I pass it off to businesses that will pay me a finder's fee if it results in a sale?
Okay.
So I got this company. It was called Intercell. I got it up and running, had it up and running for about 5 months, got involved in a competition for billion-dollar business ideas, which I won, ended up moving to California. I lived on a crazy island called Yerba Buena. It's halfway between San Francisco and Oakland.
Okay.
So if you drive, there's a bridge that takes you to an island. You go underneath, and then there's a bridge on the other side.
Yeah, I've always wondered who lives there. Now I know.
I was there. I was total life of Riley. But the funny thing is that life always seems to happen. So as I got into the contest, I was single, but by the time I won, I met a lady. We're both in our 40s, both wanted to have kids. And we decided I would move to California to take the money. I would commute back and forth. We'll try and have a family. And 6 months later, that's exactly what happened. Heather, who's now my wife, gets pregnant. And I went back to the guy that gave me the $1 million and said, I love your money, but I love this lady more. I have 6 months and I have to go home. And then what happened in order to create interest or demand in Intercell, I was doing these educational sessions in these cities across North America about teaching people about this window of dissatisfaction, when people are unhappy and thinking of changing. And when I got home, I was home for 3 days and got asked to go speak at a CEO conference. And I talked for 25 minutes, the thing that I gave back then, about this window of dissatisfaction and why it's so compelling. And a bunch of these CEOs came to me after the talk and said, so I have never heard anything like this. I've got a sales team. Can you come give a 2-day training session? And in my head, all I could think to myself was, I only have 25 minutes. But what I told them was, look, I just became a dad. Give me 6 months and we'll do a half-day version.
Okay.
And that's kind of how the whole thing got started.
Now, how did you come up with the window of dissatisfaction? And tell people in more detail exactly what that means.
Yeah, so it doesn't matter what people have today. They're using something. We're going to call that the status quo. And they just keep doing the same thing, buying from the same vendor, driving the same car, whatever it is, until something makes them unhappy and they start thinking of changing. And when people start thinking of changing, what they do during this window, I call it a window of dissatisfaction, what they do is they go through a process. And the first thing they do is they go, well, this is the problem that I have. So they define the problem, and then they start designing a solution around the problem they create. But they're so busy solving other problems, they're not doing anything about it yet.
Okay.
So people can sit in this window of dissatisfaction forever. And this window of dissatisfaction, this only took me a couple of weeks to kind of figure out. This was the magic where I just showed up in front of people at the right time. It was during this window. The part that took me a long time to figure out, most of the rest of the summer, was I could not figure out how could somebody be in the buying mode of status quo on Monday, be perhaps in a window of dissatisfaction on a Wednesday, and start this whole process of searching for alternatives by Friday.
What's changing, right?
What's changing? But here's the thing. What I was trying to figure out was what would cause that change.
Right.
And that's when my second epiphany came along, was that these people change because events make them change. So I'm a decision maker. I'm in the buying mode of status quo. All of a sudden something happens and it makes me want to change. So that's when I had this first epiphany about these events or triggers, which I call them. And that's why we call it trigger event selling, because these events then move people out of status quo into a window of dissatisfaction. And my luck as a sales guy said if I got there first, my average close ratio was 80%. When I surveyed 200 VPs of sales, 200 plus, and 200 plus senior salespeople, it turns out that I wasn't that much better than average, because when I talked to all of them, they told me the number was 75%.
Okay.
Forrester did some research a few years ago, but they didn't ask the question of salespeople. They asked the question of decision makers. The last time you made a major purchase, How often did you give the business to the first person that you spoke to? And the Forrester research says 74%. So this is where you really need to find a way to get in front of somebody, help them define a problem in such a way that your solution becomes the ideal way, and then you start developing a relationship and you put yourself in line to be the successful salesperson who gets the business.
So all that makes perfect sense. And I guess what I'm wondering is, how do you detect who's in the window of dissatisfaction, and what are some of the triggers that you might know about? Because obviously something can happen in someone's head that's going to have a huge impact on them, but you don't necessarily get to live inside their head. So how do you from the outside understand all this?
Yeah, so there's two things. So the first thing you can do is you can listen. And when I say listen, I mean listen to conversation. Because what I've learned is when I talk to people that are in the window of dissatisfaction, they'll almost always tell me one of two things. They'll say, Craig, I'm thinking of changing. Why don't you phone me back in 6 months?
Okay.
But what happens when we phone them back in 6 months? They've already made a decision. So I now know every time someone says, I'm thinking of doing this, phone me back in 6 months, I know these are people in the window of dissatisfaction. I also have learned that when people tell me about the problem they want to have solved or the outcome they're trying to accomplish instead of the product or service they want to buy, these are also people in the window of dissatisfaction. Now, this window of dissatisfaction, I'm going to call this the ABCs of trigger events. The A stands for awareness.
Okay.
This is the stuff that we do. We go to somebody, we say, we're better, we're faster, we're cheaper. The challenge is, if you don't have the best relationship, even if you have the best idea, your ideas get borrowed and given to the people that have a better relationship.
Okay.
So these awareness strategies, better, faster, cheaper, generally don't work. The B is when people have a bad experience with their current provider. And they have a bad experience very often based upon a change in people. So in my case, it turns out a change in salespeople.
Mm.
The last time I saw a statistic, I think it was by a group called Chatham Partners. It said 28% of all vendor changes are triggered by a switch in salespeople. So I'm your salesperson. You're the customer. You and I have a great relationship. I understand your expectations. If I do anything stupid,
right,
we have a relationship. You complain, I fix it. You stay in the status quo. I leave, somebody else takes my place. They don't understand your expectations. They don't have the same relationship. They do something stupid. You're like, well, I'm just going to give it to my number two person because I can't be bothered to train this person like I trained Craig. So a change in people. Bad experience, sometimes a change in the product. So sometimes the product itself changes, or some material change in the provider.
Okay.
Sometimes what happens is there's a merger or an acquisition or something else happens with that company. So that's the B's, right? The B's are really good. People want to change. You can't always predict them. You have to be very sort of observant to look for them. The last one, the C's, these are the changes that happen inside your customers or your prospects. And again, the big change is a change in people, decision makers. There's some really cool research by a group called Discover.org. And their research says that a decision maker, I'm going to call that a VP or higher, it says the data says 80% of new VPs or higher will make $1 million worth of decisions or more in their first year on the job. What the data also says is that 40% of that 80% make those changes in the first 90 days.
So it's like they're coming in with an agenda already and they're putting their stamp on their org.
They're coming in with an agenda. I need to prove I'm better than Ruben, so I got to shake things up. So 32% of all decision makers, VPs or higher, that are new in their job will make $1 million worth of decisions or more in the first 90 days in their job. So you just follow job changes.
And that's something that at the VP level might be public, or it might be on LinkedIn, or it might be in the local business journal.
Totally. Press releases, all kinds of other ways. But here's the thing to always keep in mind, that one job change does not create a single opportunity. So I'm going to use the Beatles as an example. Okay. So you've got this person, Ringo, who was a customer, and he leaves and goes somewhere else. The first thing you want to do is you want to follow him. Because if he used you in the past, odds are he'll use you again.
Right.
Now, you find out that Ringo replaces Paul. Now, Paul is in a new job.
I thought he replaced Pete.
Odds are.
Not to be pedantic.
Well, Ringo, yeah. So Ringo replaces Paul. So follow Ringo. Paul now is in a new job. Paul's got a new job. It means he probably has more money, more authority, and more influence than he had in his last job. So you got to go follow Paul.
Okay.
Then what you want to do to keep that person as a customer, you got to find a way to make sure you talk to John, because John replaces Ringo. So you want to keep them as a customer. But the value of understanding that John has replaced Ringo is you get to ask a question. You get to go to John and you get to ask the question, where did you come from?
Right. Because
that's enough.
Opening.
They have an opening. So it's actually not that hard. U.S. Census data tells us that 3% of people change jobs every single month. So if I have 100 VPs or higher, and let's just say I'm going to focus just on selling to VPs of finance to begin with, right? January, 3 of them change. Okay, where did they go? Who did they replace? Because that person's doing their job. March comes along, right? The first group of people get filled in. Now there's 6 more opportunities. So you very quickly get to be able to get a very large number of opportunities by just following these job changes. And that assumes that you're only going in to a VP of finance. Well, what if you go into a VP of operations and a VP of sales? So now, instead of having 100 people, you got 300 people in 100 different companies, and it's easy.
Okay. So that makes sense. So now we know we have, or at least we have some way of figuring out a subset of the people who might be in this window of dissatisfaction. Because obviously there's going to be others that maybe just are in stealth mode and we'll never detect. But we have a mechanism for detecting a bunch of them. And I don't know whether there's a bunch of people reading your book or doing your training or whatever it is, but I feel like there's a lot of like sort of LinkedIn spam based on this kind of philosophy. Once you figure out who these people are, how do you stand out and do something meaningful for them as opposed to being just another hackster banging on their door trying to sell them stuff?
Good question. So most of the hacksters have no idea what they're doing. They're not doing this. They're just blindly spamming everybody, hoping somebody fits, right? The problem that the vast majority of those people have is they're using nouns to describe the product or service that they sell.
Okay.
They're not using verbs to describe the value of being their customer. What's the impact?
So give me an example.
I'm going to give you an example of, I'm going to pick up the phone. I'm going to call the VP of a trucking firm.
Okay.
And I'm going to say, hi, Ruben, my name's Craig Elias. And I have a really simple way of making you the preferred vendor in your industry.
Okay.
What are you going to ask me?
That sounds interesting. How do I do that?
How? So then I'm going to have a conversation with you. So Ruben, if I told you, or if I was to give you a perspective that the person with the highest on-time delivery statistic is usually the preferred vendor, would you agree with me?
I'm going to pretend I'm a VP of a trucking company right now and say, sure.
Yeah. So then here's all I do. I have a really simple way of making sure you have the best OTD in the system. And you're going to go, well, what do you sell? I sell really expensive tires. You break down less. You have a higher on-time delivery statistic. And anytime any of your customers have something that's urgent and important and price is not the issue, they phone you before they phone anybody else.
So you don't call up and say, I'm selling you fancy tires.
No. So I'll give you another example. I'll talk about warehousing.
Okay.
So if I were to pick up the phone and say to a VP of finance who just got their job, or CFO, hi, Ruben, my name's Craig Elias, and I have a really simple way to eliminate inventory write-downs.
Okay, that sounds interesting. How do you do that?
How? That's the only thing we're trying to get to. When I pick up the phone and call a VP of sales, I say one of two things. I have a really simple way for more of your reps to make quota, or I know how to turn more of your B players into A players.
Okay.
They all ask me how. Now, then you get to have a conversation. The mistake most people make, sometimes especially nerds that are in sales, they love their product and they puke all over the person.
Yes.
This is, oh, I do this. They don't ask questions. So one of the best things I've learned about sales is if someone asks you a question, you always ask a question back.
Okay.
What makes you say that? What makes you ask? But you want to understand context before you give people content so people understand how to make your product or service relevant to the problem that they have.
So that makes a lot of sense. How do you do that in a way that doesn't sound like you're sort of like trying to jujitsu them with some kind of fancy sales stuff? Like you're just having a normal conversation and it happens to be, I need more information.
That's a good question. So I think there's nothing wrong with asking questions. And for me, I think the secret is don't go in with 20 questions. Go in with 3.
Okay.
And what happens is every question that you ask, so you have the first 3, we'll ask the first question, they're going to give you an answer. Your next question is based upon the answer they just gave you. What makes you say that? How does that impact your business? So you try to find a way to, it's more of a conversation if you just continue asking what are called second order or third order questions. Don't just ask one question and leave that topic. You sort of ask more to dig a little deeper. And then when you've gotten there, you move on to the second thing you want to ask a question about.
Let me get some real-time sales training from you, because oftentimes when I'm in this situation, I say, I could talk about my stuff for hours and probably bore you to tears. Let me make sure I'm understanding what you're really asking about. Is that fair?
Are you asking if that's a good way to do this, or is that just you're pretending that's what you're saying to me on a call?
No, I'm sorry. So the last question, is that fair? Is that a fair approach? Is asking for your feedback, right? Is that the right way to do this?
That's a good question. I tend to find that people these days are pressed for time, so I always try to get to the chase. And I'm really only interested in people that have a specific problem. If somebody doesn't think they have a problem with inventory, I'm not going to talk to them.
Right.
So if someone says, I don't have an inventory write-down problem, okay, not a problem. When that comes up, let me know. Because here's the reason I say that. There are enough people out there that are dissatisfied with the problem that I solve. My job isn't to create that dissatisfaction. My job is to find people that have that dissatisfaction.
And that's really important, right? You're not trying to convince somebody that their knee hurts. You're trying to find people with knee pain.
Yeah. So the other thing I want to make sure we spend a little bit of time on before we finish is the third epiphany I had that summer. So the first one was the window of dissatisfaction.
Okay.
The second was events. So one event makes people unhappy, makes them want to change. One event gives them more money or more time so they can afford to change. And one event lets them justify the purchase of themselves or other people. But the third epiphany that I had that summer was that for the first time in 20 years, I'd done something different than what my sales managers had taught me.
Okay.
So for 20 years, my sales managers had a philosophy. If you lose the business, don't lose the lesson. And I spent 20 years analyzing my losses, trying to figure out how do I win. Well, what I did for the first time in 20 years in that summer was I analyzed the business I had won, not the business I had lost.
Got it. Okay.
And here's what was interesting for me. When I had that epiphany, I went to Google. I searched between quotes the words lost sales analysis. So how do I find anything that has those 3 words together in that order? I found 50,000 pages on the internet that talked about how to analyze the business you lose. Now, odds are if you lost the business because you didn't have the best relationship. And if you don't have the best relationship, people are going to lie to you anyway. So you're not getting much out of doing this lost sales analysis. But what I did that summer, after I searched for lost sales analysis and found 50,000 pages, I took out the word lost, replaced it with the word won, W-O-N.
Right.
Did a look for one sales analysis in the summer of 2002. And how many pages do you think I found?
50.
2.
All right.
So it amazes me that we spend all this time analyzing the business we lose, trying not to lose, instead of analyzing all the business we win and say, how do we win more business just like this?
Right. What's that quote from Dostoevsky or something? It's like there's a million different ways for families to be unhappy, but there's only one way for them to be happy, or something like that.
It's not one that I've heard of, but it's something I'm now going to look for, right? It's on my radar screen. So this is for me, the value of analyzing the deals you win. What was the event that made you switch? When did those events happen? What made you choose us? You are not allowed to ask people why questions. Why questions make people defensive? What made you choose us?
So what versus why?
What or how versus why?
Because why, you're asking them to justify themselves.
Something. Like why? Like you go to your kids. Why did you paint on the wall? You go to your wife. Why did you book dinner at 6:30 instead of 7? People get instantly defensive when you ask a why question. What and how questions make you come across, hopefully you are, way more curious.
How did you decide to have dinner at 6:30? What made you?
Yeah, what made you not what made you think, but what was the thought process around 6:30? What made you choose 6:30? How did you It's amazing the difference that simple little thing can make. But here's the piece that's important. When you ask that third question, what made you choose us? What good salespeople are listening for are verbs.
Okay.
They're listening for verbs that describe the value of being your customer.
What does that mean?
What does that mean? It means I was not smart enough to figure out that the value proposition I bring is turning more A players and more B players into A players. My customers told me that.
Okay.
I was selling sales training to help you get in front of the right people at the right time. But people didn't understand how that was relevant to them.
Got it. Okay.
There was no context. Now they're like, oh, you can turn more of my B players into A players? How fast can you get here?
Right.
So it's all about the value. And this for me is when you call or email, whatever it is, but you're always leading with value. Here's the value of being my customer, right?
And if you're confused about it, as you say, you ask people who you've helped, what did you actually do for them? Because it may be different than what you think.
Totally. It almost always is. And here's the thing. Most people have no idea what the value of being their customer is.
Right.
So I'm going to give you an example. But and this is just it's not a personal. I have to be careful how I use this example because this just happened to me, but it wasn't happening for this reason. But when do you think most couples get divorced?
Boy, we've got all kinds of interesting stuff going on in this interview. I was just about to say you're giving people marital advice with how and why and what questions.
Oh yeah.
And now we're deep into it. I don't know. 7 years?
When kids move out of the house.
Oh, okay. Trigger event.
So now, totally trigger event. Now, what if I told you I had a really simple way for couples to stay married longer?
I would say how?
Do you know what I'm selling? Yeah, you know what I'm selling?
You could be selling all kinds of things, but it's probably very valuable.
Puppies.
Okay. I didn't see that coming. There's something else to unite you.
So when you understand the value of being your customer, that's what you're selling. It's not about the noun that describes the product or service. It's the verb that describes the value or the outcome of using that product or service.
So keeping couples together or whatever it may be, reducing inventory return.
Yeah, so this is good. So there are words that tend to trigger people to say how more often. So if you take away a negative, take away a pain, it's very different than giving someone a vitamin.
Right.
So the words that I like to use, reduce, minimize, or eliminate.
Okay.
I can reduce inventory write-downs. I can minimize inventory write-downs. I can eliminate inventory write-downs. I can minimize the likelihood that you get divorced when your kids move out of the house.
Right. That sounds important.
Those things people tend to move more. They tend to act more to move away from a negative than to move towards a positive. So in many ways, it's about understanding a problem that has implications. So we're selling painkillers, not vitamins, because people tend to act a whole lot faster when you're selling painkillers.
That makes a lot of sense. So if I can recap, people will end up in a place where they're not about to do something different, but they're kind of like, wait a second, this isn't working out for me great. This is the window of dissatisfaction. There's trigger events that may move them through that into and then out of that window of dissatisfaction. And if you can catch those trigger events and talk to people in the window of dissatisfaction, you have a much better chance. And then if you talk to them about what outcomes they want, not what you're selling, whether it's puppies or tires or whatever, you have a much better chance of actually winning the deal. And then think about what's going on in your won deals, not so much what happened in the deals that you lost. Is that a good recap so far?
It's a good recap. Can I just give you one extra thing for everybody to think about?
Keep going.
So there's a few years ago, I was at Dreamforce, and I was helping this startup sort of dissect analysis, this one sales analysis of some of the deals he's won because he was trying to find a way to scale. And we came across a really interesting anomaly that turns out there's some data behind. And what he realized is that whenever there was two people on the first meeting or first real call, not the one that you cold call, but they were more likely to win the deal.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense.
And it turns out, so I think his name is Donato Dario. His data, his research says you are 3 times more likely to get someone as a customer when you have 2 people on the first call.
So you got both decision makers or whatever the situation is.
You want someone with the problem and somebody who's got the authority or money. So whenever someone says, wow, that's interesting, I would love, like, how do we talk more? When can we schedule a meeting? I'm always going to say, so Ruben, we can do this whenever you want, but here's my first question. Who else should we have on that call? Who else should be in that meeting? You always want 2 people on that first call.
Got it. Who else should be in that meeting? And that's a nice way of saying it that doesn't undermine the authority of somebody who may not want to admit that they don't have 100% control over this decision.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. All right. So to switch gears just for a second, how's that Tom Gore treating you?
So I only get to have one class because I have to drive to a campus for a college to go help some students become entrepreneurs.
Yeah, if you have too much before you go back to college, that might be the wrong approach.
Totally the wrong impression.
There's only so far that authenticity can take you when you're supposed to be an expert, I imagine. Yeah, I have the same problem. I have one glass of that Petite Sirah, which is treating me quite well, and then I have to go drive somewhere as well. But Craig, thank you so much. This has been extremely valuable for me, and it's funny because I feel like I'm familiar with your work. I've read your book. I've been on some of your webinars and so on, and I still get new things out of this, and I hope it's helpful for other people as well, whether we're talking about their sales efforts or their relationships, because there's some good tips in here for how to ask questions properly in your relationships as well.
Cool. Ruben, a pleasure.
All right. Thanks, Craig. Have a great one.
You too. Bye.
Bye.
Have a friend who'd benefit from this episode? Pass the word along. Have a friend who wouldn't benefit from this episode but you haven't talked to in a while? Give them a call. Of course, iTunes reviews are great for getting the word out and also for helping me make the show that you want. So if you've got topics or guests that you want discussed on the podcast or in the apparently upcoming Sales for Nerds book, let me know. And if you want to automate client acquisition, turning more web visitors into leads into conversations and onto closed deals while helping you stay in touch with the people who matter, check out Mimiran.com. That's www.mimiran.com. And once again, thanks for listening.